Well, yes, and I will tell you, the last few weeks I've been using a PowerPoint whenever I have been teaching. And when I went through today, because we're looking at immigration and immigration primarily from the Civil War up until the early 20th century because of the impact that it had, how industrialization increased immigration and how immigration then led to an increase in industrialization. And I was telling Suzette that one of the problems is I began to look for photographs other than photographs of people coming through Ellis Island or coming through San Francisco or whatever. So many of the photographs were very stereotypical. And I decided we'll just talk today. So I'm going to kind of walk you through some of what was historically going on as far as immigration, some of the issues that were confronting us as a nation, and then how we responded to those issues, both socially and a little bit about some of the legislation. And I have to preface it by saying, we look back and I think we're sometimes struck by how often as people we're very frightened when change occurs. In fact, before everyone got signed on, we were talking and I said, I'm predominantly, and you could pretty well tell by looking at me, I'm predominantly Scottish, Irish, German, Swiss, and Dutch, pretty much Northern European. And the majority of my ancestors came early. So they very early on, of course, the Irish in particular, there was a lot of concern about the Irish coming into the country and how that was going to change the predominantly English composition of so many of the early settlers. Well, we're going to see wave after wave after wave how that's going to change. So I thought I'd walk us through. When we talk about immigration in that second half of the 19th century, after about 1870, the fact that we now have moved from wind sail ships to steam-powered ships that made transportation from Europe to the United States much cheaper than it had been in the past. It also made it swifter, although not swift in the terms that we would consider today. But the transportation became easier and you had more people being able to immigrate if they chose to. They didn't have to try and stow away. You also find, if you look at European history, that farming improvements, most of Eastern and Southern Europe was still predominantly agrarian in that second half of the 19th century. Industrialization occurred here I am using my hands. You could tell the teacher in me, and I'm in my head seeing a map, and I was about to say industrialization occurred, British Isles, and then not as much in France, but along the northern borders of France, but over into Germany. In particular, you've got industrialization. It's really the British Isles and Germany that are industrializing rapidly. Russia will join some of that by the 1890s, but Eastern and Southern Europe is still agrarian. I mean, think Italy, wine, olives, even Eastern Europe, you think the same sorts of things, more grains and things of that nature. And with increased improvements in farming conditions, that meant that you have a lot of people who were fairly well uneducated in those areas, who had been agrarian workers who found themselves without jobs. And it seemed like that was an ideal time to immigrate to a land of opportunity, which was how the United States had been being built since the beginning of the 19th century, how it still is perceived around the world even today, even though there are restrictions, and even though we know that there are different levels of success, different levels of opportunity, the truth of the matter is, compared to everywhere else, there's a lot going on here. So what we're going to have at that second half of the 19th century is a huge wave of immigration. Some of the literature contemporary to the time refers to it as a flood of immigration, because in that 50-year period, you're going to have about 25 million Europeans coming to the United States, predominantly Italian, Greek, Hungarian, Polish. They were the bulk, though those four nations were the bulk of who was coming in the second half of the 20th century. But it's kind of interesting. Also within that, you're going to have And it's hard for us to have accurate records because, as those of you that have been looking at the 1950 census, not everything that you think is going to be on there is on there. That's true with documentation about immigrants, but we know that of those 25 million, somewhere between 2.5 and 4 million of them were Jewish by cultural descent, by religious descent. And what those 25 million new people coming into the United States in that second half of the 19th century, they will make up a bulk of the US labor pool. And they will make it possible in the more industrialized areas for the growth of industry, much of the industry we referred to 2 weeks ago, steel, coal, coming into the 20th century, automobiles, a continuation of textiles, which had been around for over 100 years, garment production. A lot of that's going to be immigrant labor. And what's interesting is there will be a number of those people, especially when we look at textiles and garments, who will bring with them some really highly developed skills because of the cultures in which they came from, and weaving and what we would look at as knitting, crocheting, all sorts of embellishments that would occur. So their arrival in the United States will have an awful lot to do with us kind of jumping to the forefront of the economic world competition. I think when we closed off 2 weeks ago, I was talking about, Britain had ruled from an industrial sense during the 19th century, but also from a global economic sense. The British Empire was so vast, so many people, so much incredible wealth. But what we will find coming into the 20th century is a steady decrease in British domination, and little by little, the US beginning to really step into that arena. What's interesting, and just sort of an overview before we get into some of the specifics, the majority of immigrants were fairly well welcomed. And when I say fairly well welcomed, in contrast to those who were less welcome were those who were Asian. And historians have done a tremendous amount of study. We're well aware that so many people came in from Asia with the construction of the railroads. We talked about it even with, the Transcontinental Railroad being built, with the mining that was going on in the West. And we know that a number of Chinese immigrants came in during that period of time. But because there was no common language, even though you look at Slavic languages, Romance languages, European, while there are distinct differences, when you looked at individuals and as people just looked at faces, there was a sort of a common European, Indo-European thread that you would see in that. When we start having a higher level of immigration coming in from Asia, it's sort of an unknown for the majority of people. It's a culture that we don't understand. It's a language that we cannot even attempt to phonetically read because it's character-based. Culture, religion, tradition, all those things are so much different, so that while the Chinese in particular are brought in to help construct the railroads, in many ways, they, by the 1880s, 1890s, and going to the turn of the century, are going to be referred to so often in the newspapers and the literature and everything as an alien culture, which is interesting how we use the word alien now. If you think about it in modern space connotation or whatever, it's certainly an unknown, and in many cases a very fearful. So there's going to be some intense anti-Chinese agitation that will occur in California in particular and in the West, and we'll kind of take a look at all of that. It's interesting, I had the picture that I put up on Facebook announcing what we were going to be doing today. I had a friend of mine, Brent Falk, who lives here in Chattanooga, who texted me, who was at Ellis Island just last week with his family because it was spring break. He had taken his wife, 4 children. They had gone to New York, and they'd gone to Ellis Island because Brent's grandfather immigrated through Ellis Island. And he texted me and said, the photo that you have up, I just saw in place at Ellis Island last week. And I said, isn't it absolutely an amazing experience? So let's talk about Ellis Island just a little bit. Of that 25 million or so who came into the United States during the second half of the 19th century, somewhere around half of them, 12 million to 13 million of them, came through Ellis Island. It was the busiest immigration inspection, and that's how it was billed at that point, immigration inspection station, from 1892 until it closed in 1954. And they referred to it as an immigration inspection because, of course, if you've read very much about, or some of the documentaries, they were screening primarily for illnesses that were transmittable, was someone going to be able to be a productive working citizen? Were there physical disabilities? Were there mental disabilities and such? And in some cases, of course, people were not admitted to be able to come into the United States because part of what they were looking for were citizens who could contribute to the overall well-being of the nation. In the 35 years before Ellis Island opened, it's kind of interesting, more than 8 million people came into New York City, immigrated into New York City, but most of them were processed through, there was a small depot in lower Manhattan down across the bay, sort of from the Statue of Liberty, that was called Castle Garden Immigration. And though that station had opened up, and at that point in time, each state controlled their own immigration. There was not a federal Department of Immigration. So the federal government took control of immigration in 1890, and that's when Congress appropriated $75,000 to construct our first immigration station there on Ellis Island. And I always look at that $75,000 and try to reflect in my mind what that was in 1890. But they were able to dig wells. They were able, that construction cost included a tremendous amount of landfill being brought in from incoming ships, their ballast that they would use to weight the ships, because they expanded the island actually, and they then construct what is a 3-story huge building, and it becomes the immigration station with all sorts of channels for processing people and everything. That included subway tunnels that would allow easy access in some cases, and a barge office and all sorts of other things for $75,000. So, you just look at that and go, wow. That first station, as I mentioned, was a huge 3-story structure, lots of outbuildings, built entirely of Georgia pine. Throwing that out there in case there's anyone here listening from Georgia, because one, pine was a little bit cheaper, but pine was also very hardy, and it contained all the amenities, bathrooms and things that they thought it would possibly need. And it opened with a huge celebration on January the 1st in 1892. 3 ships docked that very day. 700 immigrants came through the very first day it was open. And when we think about the fact that about 5 million to 7 million had come through New York City prior to Ellis Island opening, it's interesting to know that 500,000 immigrants came through Ellis Island the very first year that it was open. So how did the nation react to the idea that our demographics was changing and our composition as far as ethnicity and language and religion and culture and everything was changing? The last half of the 19th century is a fascinating time to study social history, to look at those sorts of things. Because so many people were coming in a short period of time, we actually have, and in many cases, what makes it interesting is many cases, you have people who themselves were just 1 or 2 generations into the United States who are really concerned about the high level of immigration that's coming in. And something occurs that what historians refer to as xenophobia. And xenophobia just really is that fear that people had that this new increase that was coming into the country. And I was trying to look at the chat question that Tim had just asked, what percentage changes from the immigrants what percentage change were the Actually, it's kind of interesting. So if you look at the population of the United States and look at where we were in about 1870, 1880, the 25 million that will come in during that period of time is about a third of what was already here. So if you think about what that would mean, if you think about Chattanooga, where we consider ourselves to be roughly a 200,000 number of citizens in this region, it's interesting to think about if demographically all of that changed, and in a period of 10 or 20 years, which is when most of this will occur, actually 1880s to 1900, we had, say, 70,000 people come into the community that were different as far as us ethnicity, language, and everything. And it does create some fear in the people that are there. And that's what you began to see. Many of them considered immigration, and it's interesting, if you go back and you read the literature, read the newspaper articles, everything, they considered it a danger to the nations. And the phrase that's used so often is health and security. So it's not just a foreign security issue, but it's a health. What are these unknown people bringing? What are they doing? What's different about their culture? So much so that one of the first groups that forms, and it forms in 1893, remember that Ellis Island opens in 1890, forms, and it's called the Immigration Restriction League. And there were a number of other organizations that are sort of birthed during that same period of time that will all be lobbying with Congress to curtail foreign immigration. It almost sounds like today sometimes when we talk about the issues of immigration. There's very little, that's so cliche, but I sort of say there's very little that's new under the sun. It's really kind of fascinating. The truth of the matter is, if you kind of look back, and historians always look back, but if you think back to the 1840s and the 1850s, and I have mentioned this before, tremendous amount of opposition in the 1840s and the 1850s to the Irish and the Germans, especially German Catholics and the Irish Catholics, German Protestants, a little easier to deal with. Those who were Lutheran, they were less suspect, but Irish and German Catholics, so much so that you had the entire nativist movement that originates in the 1850s. And interestingly, it was organized in New York City in 1843. And the fear there was, if you go back and you look at the New York City newspaper articles and things from the 1840s, their fear was that it was not so much, the Irish and the English, while they have historically always fought, from an ethnicity standpoint, they're very similar. It's religion and culture that's really different. But the fear was the Catholicism, and the articles that you read from the 1840s with this concern of German and Irish Catholics coming in is, they're not going to assimilate into our culture. They're not going to be guided by the principles of the Constitution. They're not going to follow the lead of their local representation, their mayors, their governors, their president. They will take their orders from the Pope. And that's the literature. And what's really bad is, and I hate to admit it, I was a small child, but I'm old enough to remember that when John Kennedy ran for president in 1960, that there were, and I've gone back and dragged some of them out because my students used to find it so interesting. There were all sorts of editorials about, while he is a good Irish family and they've been here for several generations, and, he is an up and coming member of the US Senate, we don't know that we could trust him to be president because he is Catholic. And the editorials used the same argument that people had used in the 1840s. And it's interesting that 120 years later, the fear again was the control from the Vatican, the control from the hierarchy of the Catholic Church. Now that nativist movement that was opposed to the German and Irish Catholics, it lasted until about 1856. So from 1854, when that group organizes in New York City, they're pretty much disappearing by 1850, or from 1846, when they are organizing in New York City, until about 1856. And they began to dissipate by 1856 because there was a looming issue that was more of concern, and that was the issue of what appeared to be pending civil war over the issues of states' rights, slavery, and all of that. So, and many of those nativist groups could not agree on how they felt about the issue of slavery, so they sort of just disappeared for a period of time. During this period that we're talking about, that's really interesting, the 1880s and 1890s, it's interesting to look at the patterns of where immigrants went. So about 1.5 million Swedes and Norwegians came to the United States from that period of 1880 to 1900. What's really interesting is that was almost 20% of the total population of their two nations put together. So imagine, as a nation, your immigrants, your EMMIGRANTS who are leaving, 1 in 5 of your national population is leaving to go someplace else. Now, the Swedes and the Norwegians as a group predominantly, and there's exceptions to all this, but they predominantly settled in the northern Midwest. A higher concentration, Minnesota, the Dakotas, Iowa, some in that area. The Danish did not immigrate in the same numbers as did the Swedes and the Norwegians, because the Danish economy being more tied into the European continental economy, the Danish economy was a little bit stronger. What's interesting is the highest percentage of all immigrants coming in during this period of time who adopt Mormonism, the Danes are the highest number who will convert to the Mormon faith, the Church of the Latter-day Saints. So there's a tremendous number of Danes who, once they do come here, adopt the Mormon faith. And so they will settle more than any place else. They settle in Utah. Of the Eastern European nation, more Poles came than of any other nation. And, quite frankly, as someone who taught Eastern European history for a long time, the Polish people have always been in a position, they've had difficulty with their economy. They've never had a strong government. They tried to move toward an attempt at a constitutional monarchy, 200 years ago, some sort of a constitutional monarchy, 200 years before much of the rest of Europe did, but they were never able to manage it. And what kept their economy, their social fiber and everything so disrupted was that they were on the best level plains in all of Eastern Europe. So anytime there was a conflict between Eastern and Western Europe, the armies marched across Poland. And that's true even into the 20th century. So when the Polish were able to begin to immigrate, and in particular, a number of Polish Jews, but Polish people as a group, they immigrate, and there will be more of the Polish Catholics who will immigrate than Polish other Orthodox religious groups, whether it's Jewish or it's Orthodox Eastern European religions. Chicago will be the benefactor of so much of that Polish immigration, large concentrations in that area. What you find, New York City and the larger cities along the coast, Philadelphia, to some extent in Boston, but not quite as much, you're going to find larger populations. Of course, the Irish were there first, but you're going to have larger concentrations of Jewish immigrants and certainly Italian immigration that occurs during that time. Many of the Germans and Central Europeans who are going to come in during that period of 1880 to 1900 are going to move to the Midwest because of jobs in industry, but also mining experience. Many of the Germans and Eastern Europeans had experience in mining, and there's quite a bit, we don't think about that today, but especially in the northern Midwest. And then if you move a little bit to the western part of the Midwest, there's quite a bit of mining that would go on there. What's interesting too, and I'd really never thought about it until I started really looking at it, is that during this period of time, you have 1 million French Canadians who will leave Quebec and will move into New England. And And I think about that today because I realize, in having worked on DAR papers for applicants and everything, how often I see a line where, 3 of their 4 lines are predominantly European. They've been here for a while. Maybe there's a line that they came in the 19th century, either Irish, whatever. But how many of them I'll have one line that will come out of Canada, and it's as a rule, it's French Canadian. And I don't know that I was ever aware of that when I was studying social history and immigration patterns and everything. It's kind of fascinating. From what we today refer to as the Midwest or the Middle East, the largest number of immigrants that will come to this country during that period of time, the last quarter of the 19th century, will be Lebanese and Syrian. I think a lot of people think that Middle Eastern immigration only began in the late 20th century, but that's not true at all. Large numbers of Lebanese and Syrian in particular, late 19th century, early 20th century. The majority of those who came from Lebanon and Syria were Lebanese Syrian Christians who were coming here for what they saw as religious freedom. But there will be numbers that come from those two countries who are Jewish and Muslim also. Most of them are going to settle in the New England area, and then they will eventually, second generation, third generation, sort of disperse out from that area. You'll find in the 1920s and the 1930s, a lot of those immigrants who are continuing to come from the Middle East are going to settle farther west. And when I say farther west, I'm talking about Detroit in particular. And then you'll also, if you look at the demographics, which is fascinating, in the early first quarter of the 20th century, the majority of people of Arabic descent who come to the United States settle in the Midwest because they have experience with farming, with agriculture. And while their agricultural traditions, they had to battle not having a lot of water, not having a deep topsoil or whatever, the Midwest appeals to them. So you're going to have a tremendous number of Arab Americans who will settle in that area. The largest number of Russians who immigrate to the United States in the last quarter of that 19th century are going to be Russian Jews. And they are fleeing the fact that Alexander III, when he comes to the throne in 1880, after the assassination of his father, one of the things that he's going to do, because his father had been quite lenient. His father was actually working on a constitution that would have ended serfdom and would have given a constitution and the rights to vote and everything. And he's actually assassinated on the day in which he had signed that charter to start that constitution, which is one of those ironic things in history. His son, Alexander III, because of his dad's assassination, when he comes to power, is going to lash out, and it's going to be autocracy and orthodoxy. And, he is in charge of everything. And one of the things he's going to attempt to do is to sort of round up the others. And that's going to be predominantly the Jews, and they will go into the pogroms. So you're going to have a large number, 2 million Russian Jews who will come into the United States in that last quarter of the 19th century. What most people don't know is that after 1934, the United States actually put in place laws that prohibited people who were Jewish from immigrating to the United States. In an attempt to control immigration, they put that law, our government put that law in place in 1934. And of course, that's one of the things that we hear so often about now when we talk about the rise of Hitler legitimately becoming Chancellor of Europe Chancellor of Germany in 1933, legitimately put in power. And then the beginning of that systematic Kristallnacht, and the final solution and everything is one of the criticisms the United States faces is the fact that we did not take a lot of those Jewish refugees who wanted to come here because we had closed our borders to those who were Jewish. I just noticed that Tim asked a question about what drove French Canadian immigration. A lot of it's kind of interesting. What my research showed was that a lot of them thought that there would be a better chance for them to be themselves here than they would be in Canada, because at that point there was a lot of conflict between all of the English provinces. There was an attempt in the early 20th century, there was an attempt within my lifetime for Quebec to pull out of the Canadian Commonwealth. So while we were predominantly English speaking, also we have a little bit of a better record, I suppose, in allowing people to enjoy their own individual culture. Oh my gosh, and the time goes so quickly. So let's talk a little bit about legislation. So when people get frightened, they start calling at this point, they start writing their congressmen, they start lobbying. So you have, these people who are looking around and saying, my neighborhoods are changing. There are people coming in, I don't understand the language they're speaking. Too many too quickly, they're taking the jobs. In fact, with industrialization, early industrialization, it wasn't an issue because there's so many new jobs, and there were so many jobs that were more menial, for the want of a better word. They were unskilled labor. They didn't pay as much as the skilled labor. So in the early days, there was less fear of that. But as things began to grow, as the market expands, as people learn jobs, then there is this great fear that immigrants coming in who have some industrial experience or who are quick studies because they were smart in their own cultures. They were smart, and they're motivated by this desire to succeed, motivated by caring for their families and everything. They're going to take the jobs that Americans now hold. So there's going to be attempts to begin to legislatively control. 1875, the United States takes over the issue of immigration. I think I mentioned a few minutes ago. Up until then, individual states could control immigration, but really the only states where it was an issue were those states with large ports. Side note, immigration through New Orleans was never an issue, and I find it really interesting that it has to be, when you look at demographics, the fact that Louisiana was already such a mixed cultural state, more so at that point in the 1880s or the 1890s, much more mixed culture than probably any other state in the Union, because it was Spanish, it was French, it was mixed Creole, large Caribbean influence, and then English and other Europeans. So New Orleans never had immigration quotas of any sort, but a lot of the larger New York City, Philadelphia, Boston, as you come down the coast, you'll see more and more of it. So what you begin to find are individuals in Congress speaking out about nativism. And what they're going to talk about is they're very concerned about preserving the status of established inhabitants as compared to those who are newcomers or immigrants coming in. And it's this concern that it's going to not only in the taking of jobs, but the cultural values, and it will be the policy for the most part from 1880 until about 1980, that if you came to this country, you were not required by law to learn English, but if you were going to function successfully in society, you learned English. And how that normally happened for most families is family would come in, children would go to school, the children would learn, because children are very agile when it comes to learning languages, but the children would learn the language, and then the children would teach their parents at home. And while, grandmother and grandfather's English might not be as good as Johnny or Rachel, who are 6 or 7, the family assimilated. And by assimilated, they learned the language, they learned the culture. Certainly, they kept their cultural traditions as far as food. But even in many cases, they dressed the way that was the predominant dress in the United States. They worshiped in their own individual churches, but they mixed. They attended the schools with everybody else in the neighborhood. Neighborhood schools were a big thing from about 1880, once we began to have publicly funded education. From that period until about 1980, when you began to see shifts to larger schools and people being pulled out of neighborhoods. When we look at it, a lot of it really kind of comes back when they talk about the established cultural norms. When you look at the legislation, what they're really talking about is they want to make certain that those traditions, those cultures that were part of the original 13 colonies, and a lot of the legislation will say, the original 13 colonies, here's what the composition looked like, here's what was on the books as far as education and everything, and that's what they really wanted to do. The original Nativist Party formed their own political party in 1854, and I mentioned they disappear around the time of the American Civil War. What you may remember several weeks ago when we were talking about presidents, that Millard Fillmore actually ran on that party ticket when he attempted to run again for the presidency in 1856 and was unsuccessful. He's defeated by James Buchanan. But it's sort of interesting when you look at how popular that idea of keeping America for Americans, which was a slogan of the National Party, the Nativist American National Party. Just a few of the things that maybe, and I'm looking at our time to make sure that we have enough time to really kind of get through it all. When you look at the second half of the 19th century, there are some examples of action taken against immigrants, mass action, especially in Western states against Chinese, Japanese, and such. But that wasn't really the first times that we saw that. In the 1840s, there were a number of riots in Boston, in Montpelier, which is so strange. You don't think of anything happening in Montpelier, quite frankly. But you look at some of those New England cities, there were a series of riots that occurred between Catholics and what were considered to be the native populations in those American cities. In Philadelphia, actually, in 1844, there were a series of attacks on Catholic churches and Catholic community centers that actually ended up with a number of people being killed. Interestingly, as a side note, because there's a correlation there to what you see sometimes happening in Northern Ireland, and I've always thought it so ironic, the attacks that occurred in Philadelphia in 1844 occurred on holy days. They occurred around Easter when there were scheduled masses in the Catholic churches, and they knew there would be a larger attendance because that was a holy day. Those were the days that the assaults occurred on the Catholic churches. And it always seems interesting to me that in Northern Ireland or here in the United States that you choose, even those who themselves profess a religious faith, choose to attack each other on holy days. That just is one of those ironic things that I can't let go by without mentioning it. 1855, there is a police attack on German and Irish Catholics in Louisville, Kentucky, that ends up with 22 people being killed. I mean, who thinks of Louisville, Kentucky as a seething, racially tense community between Catholics and Protestants? And yet 22 people are killed. And it was because on an election day, and they were very fearful. There was a candidate who was Catholic, and there was fear that the Catholic candidate was going to win. And so there is this huge riot, and the police actually help protect those who are leading the attack. First major legislation that occurs, 1875, First Immigration Act will be passed. It was called the Page Act when it was first passed, based on the person who authored the bill and introduced it into Congress. But in our culture, it's known as the Asian Exclusion Act. And it outlawed the importation of Asian contract labor. Actually, the law says no Asian contract labor immigrants could come in, competition for jobs. No Asian woman who would engage in prostitution. That's what the law says. Can't decide if, looking at me, someone would say, she might be going to engage in prostitution. I mean, how do you determine that? And then the other thing was anyone who had any sort of a record of having been in conflict with the law in their own country. That's the first introduction into our immigration policy of looking at people who are felons or who have been imprisoned in their own nations and restricting those people from immigrating. And that's still a part of our immigration policy today. Is, you know, that was one of the things, if you'll remember, when so many of the Cuban refugees came in during the Carter administration. I'm trying to think what year that was, 79. I should know. Was that once they began to do some of the background checks, that they found that there were a number of people that were felons, but there was no way to send them back because Cuba wasn't going to take them back. So we've always been concerned about bringing undesirables into the country. So I guess that in 1875, that was Asian contract labor, Asian prostitutes, and felons. 1882, Congress goes a little bit stricter and passes what will be known as the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was very specifically geared toward the Chinese, and it actually set a number, a cap on the number of Chinese, even of good standing, that could come in to the country. That law was renewed 10 years later in 1892, and then it was renewed 10 years later again in 1902. Interestingly, in 1891, the Department of Treasury, and it's interesting that it's under the Department of Treasury, established what was the Commission on Immigration. And they then would have agents at the borders where people might be coming in to check documents and be able to determine if someone was a returning US citizen or did they have the appropriate papers to come in, even if they were visiting or come in for resettlement or whatever. And in 1894, we signed an agreement with the Canadians that while that's a long, for the most part, unpatrolled border between us and Canada, that at any of their checkpoints where people could come into the United States, that the United States Immigration Department had the authority to check the credentials also, not just the Canadians, but the US would be allowed to check them too, because there were some instances that occurred in the early 1890s where people came through the Canadian border checkpoints that would not have been admitted by our law. The Canadians were perhaps less strict in monitoring those restrictions. So in the time that we have left, let's talk a little bit about, so you've got this huge change that's occurring in what the nation looks like. And it's kind of difficult for us today to not think of ourselves. I grew up being told, you know, we are the melting pot of the world. We are this great and glorious tapestry of all these different ethnicities. And, you know, I think we all have friends that have come from very vastly different regions of the world. But what we may not realize is that their immigrant ancestors may not have been quite as welcome. A civic group, I sort of hate using the word civic group, but that's actually how it's logged when you look at the history, group that was created that spread pretty much along the eastern coast in the 1890s. 1894 is when they're founded, called the Immigration Restriction League. And it was a group that would go out and they would talk in the schools, they would talk in the community centers, you know, anywhere that people got together, and they would talk about why it would be good for the United States to control the influx and what their charter says of undesirable immigrants that were coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. Now, it's interesting that they target Southern and Eastern Europe only. Not Western Europe, and that's because the 13 colonies were originally predominantly Northwestern Europe. The League was founded in Boston and had large branches in New York City, Chicago, and eventually in San Francisco. And what their charter says is that they saw immigrants coming into this country as threatening the American way of life and the high wage pay scale, which I think is interesting that they actually put the issue of wages in their charter. And they believe that in particular, so let's get into stereotypes, which are so unfortunate. They believed that in particular, Southern Europeans, especially Italians and Sicilians, what would they be afraid of? They believed that they were bringing organized crime into a nation that had known very little crime during its history. Well, I think we can probably argue whether we as a nation had known little crime since the beginning, but the idea of organized crime, where crime was a business, that's as early as the 1890s, that sort of a stereotype. And while we know that exists, to sort of do that broad brush that anyone coming from Italy and anyone coming from Sicily, they were obviously all somehow tied into organized crime. This Immigration Restriction League, they published books, they published pamphlets, they had the meetings, they offered free newspaper articles, free editorial, free journal articles so that they could disseminate information. And their watch call was that they were sounding the alarm about the dangers of the immigrant flood time. They also attempted, they were some of the first groups to really attempt to lobby Congress to be able to get Congress to support their efforts. Now, a couple of other quick things, and then we'll open it up in case anyone has any questions. So 1882, I mentioned the Chinese Exclusion Act, and there had been what was called the Burlingame Treaty that had been signed in 1868, and it allowed the idea of restricting Chinese immigration 10 years at a time. And I mentioned that the law was repassed in 1892 and again in 1902. And part of why that all occurs was the fact that the economy, the post-Civil War economy after the 1870s, there was a major movement by labor unions. So early labor unions are coming around as we have industry beginning to accelerate, jobs in industry. And you have, in particular in California, you have a political leader by the name of Dennis Kearney, and it was called the Working Man's Party, which was their union, and it was also a political party. And the governor of California at that point in the 1870s, a guy by the name of John Bigler, they both, the political party and Bigler from his platform as governor of California, blamed the Chinese for the fact that wages were depressed during the 1880s and coming into the 1890s, coming out of the 1870s into the 1880s and the 1890s. Of course, the reality is there were a number of economic downturns that occurred during that same period of time as our economy was readjusting, moving from agrarian into agriculture and everything. But their lobbying, in particular in the state of California, will really step up the laws as they will be enforced in California more than any other state in the union when it comes to the Chinese Exclusion Act. Obviously, that's the preferred port of entry because it's the closest, but it also, ultimately, that act in 1902 will say excludes Chinese skilled and unskilled laborers. So who does that leave to come in if you're excluding both skilled and unskilled? And in particular, if they had skills in the mining industry, because that was something California was really interested in. At the turn of the century, we will add something to that says that if you are Chinese and you are coming into the United States, you have to have certification from the Chinese government that proves you're qualified to immigrate. And that really, for most Chinese, proved to be untenable because of the different provinces in China, and someone might appear with a certification or a letter from their provincial governor that said, yes, this person is cleared to immigrate, to leave the country and to immigrate into the United States. And then what would happen, of course, on our end is we would say, well, but that's from the province, that's the equivalent of our state. Where is the Chinese authorization, the Chinese government authorization? And it was a way of being able to control those numbers. The legislation also impacted those who had already settled in the United States. If you were Chinese and you left for some reason to go back to China to visit family or whatever, then you had to have certain levels of certification to be able to re-enter. The act also made Chinese immigrants permanent aliens, because if you were Chinese, you could not apply for citizenship. You could be a legal alien resident so that you were here legally, but they were excluded from that 5-year citizenship and then sitting for citizenship examinations. That doesn't change until into the 20th century. What that really did was disruptive for Chinese families in particular, because so often, as was true with Eastern European and other groups, often the men would immigrate first, be able to accumulate, find a job, accumulate some money, and then bring members of their families over. Well, at that point, then it made it very difficult for male Chinese immigrants to be able to reunite with their wives, or even to marry and start a new family, because in many cases, you could not get a marriage license if you were not a legal citizen of the country, the way that the law was written in San Francisco. One quick incident I will mention to you, and it's called the Sandlot incident, and it occurs in 1877 in San Francisco. We think today of San Francisco as being such a blending of cultures and beliefs and ideologies, and pretty much anything goes. We think in San Francisco, that's sort of the idea, that it's one of the more liberal cities in the nation as far as diversity of opinions and everything. But in 1877, there's an incident that's called the Sandlot incident, and that was what really was written about at that time as a 2-day pogrom against Chinese immigrants in San Francisco, in which the city's majority white population, July the 23rd, 1877, and it goes on the 23rd, the night of the 23rd, all day on the 24th, that there is this huge rush to attempt to intimidate Chinese Americans and to get them to leave California and to return. It was a go back to where you came from sort of movement. The posters and signs they carried said the Chinese must go. It was very openly racist, but it was also very openly violent. And the police stood back and really did very little in any way to sort of stop that burning of businesses, shattering of windows, burning of temples, all those sorts of things. So that you have more than 8,000 people who had showed up at this union meeting, and it was a socialist/Labor Party movement, but more than 8,000 people who show up and then who take to the streets to physically remove the Chinese from San Francisco. One of the descriptions of it talks about, only 4 people are killed, but the amount of property damage, most of what was then noted as Chinatown, most of it was flattened to the ground. Even what was interesting, even the Chinese Methodist Church, the Chinese Baptist Church, the Chinese Episcopal Church, those Christian religious groups that had gone into the Chinese community and had founded churches and had members, even those churches were destroyed. It was how it is classified in the newspapers in areas outside of San Francisco, is that it was a 2-day riot of ethnic violence that finally was only halted when the state militia and about 1,000 members of a citizens vigilance committee, armed with hickory pickaxe handles that they'd gotten from local hardware stores, I love that image, came out and stopped the violence. And you think about, there's not a lot of help from the police stopping this from occurring, but you have the state militia coming in, and then you have over 1,000 just citizens who grab a pickaxe handle and they're out there in the streets trying to stop the violence. It's an image that's kind of difficult to understand. final thing that I'll mention, just so that I'm not picking on California all the time. So 1890, Wisconsin. I mean, Wisconsin is seldom in the news because Wisconsin just sort of, everybody works, everybody lives their life. They enjoy their cold winter weather. They're excellent at sports and all those sorts of things. But in 1890, the Wisconsin state legislature passes a law called the Bennett Law. And it basically, well, not basically, it does shut down all German language elementary schools. What had happened was, with the high population of German immigrants who had come into Wisconsin, both Catholic and Lutheran, many of them had their children in German language elementary schools, and then they would transition into public high schools. Most of them were bilingual, and that was what the families wanted. They knew that if the children spoke German up until a certain age, and they learned English, then even as adults, they would be able to switch back and forth, and that being bilingual would allow them to remain in contact with older family members who were not as fluent in English, but it also was a cultural connection. And Wisconsin, there was a huge backlash against the Germans because of this desire to keep their German language. In fact, let me read you a quote from the newspapers. It says, one of the newspapers that was there in Wisconsin said, "We must fight alienism. The parents, the pastors, and the churches have entered in a conspiracy to darken the understanding of children by keeping their language roots in something other than the United States. They are denying their children the right to attend the free schools of their local state." And so they bill it as being, this attack that they don't want them to be educated in the public schools of the United States. There's a backlash then from the Germans there. They believed that they should have the right for their children to attend parochial schools that were funded by the parents. They were not using taxpayer dollars. I mention it only because, we think today when we talk about parental choice in schools and all those sorts of things, yet once again, nothing is new. Even then, this conflict what I do find it interesting today, the idea of Spanish immersion or other languages for elementary school kids, the idea of being able to be bilingual or trilingual is considered to be such a positive. It's hard to imagine that 100 years ago that was considered to be anti-American. It was not just, could you speak English? Could you conduct business in the predominant language of the government, which is still our predominant language, but it was, why would you want to keep the roots of where you came from if you were going to be, an American? And I find that interesting. Even though I'm predominantly Scots and Irish, I think there are people who would say the Scots and the Irish do not speak the English of the English, and that those of us in the South do not speak exactly the same English of the Queen's English either. We all have our own dialects and our own local color in our language and everything, but it's sort of interesting. Today, I think we do have more of a value of being able to speak multiple languages, but the idea that those who are unlike us are a threat against our nation is certainly not something that we haven't experienced in our own lifetimes, but it's a tremendous impact on what we will see coming into the 20th century. And that's where we'll be going when we come back next time. We'll be looking at Teddy Roosevelt and, kind of what happens with the Spanish-American War and coming into the 20th century, which we're beginning to get into. I was going to say a period I remember. I do not remember Teddy Roosevelt, but getting into an era that, 100 years ago, most of us had grandparents who were alive in 1900. And they say 3 generations is what's in our permanent memory most often, because we've heard those original stories. So we're almost to my permanent memory. My grandfather was born in 1898. So come on, Papa. Thank you all for being here today and for joining